travel to a foreign country where I don't speak the language, I always try to learn a few phrases so that I don't look like I take for granted that everybody speaks English. So I went to my phrase book and I, of course, learned how to say hello and good morning. And so when I arrived yesterday morning at the airport in Santiago, I used my knowledge and I said, buenos dias. And the response was always, how are you? Which meant, okay. I made it clear I'm not from here. Then after I arrived here, I went out with a group from this university, and among them was a student or a researcher who some of you may know, Francisca, who is actually from Chile, and I listened to how she speaks. And so I picked up on it, and this morning I tried something different, and I said, instead of buenos dias, I said, buenos dias. And it worked directly. The response back from the hotel was, ¿Cómo estás? So needless to say, the next sentences that came out of the mouths of the people that responded to me were not comprehended by me. So all that is to say, I apologize that I cannot speak to you in the language of this country, but there's one little thing that makes me feel less bad about that, and that is that in last September, I traveled back to my native country. I live in the United States, but my native country is Germany. And I gave a speech at my alma mater where I got my undergraduate degree at the Free University of Berlin. And they requested that I give a presentation in English. So this is the way the situation is. Luckily, we have a language that the thinking people of this world understand. And so with any further ado, I'd like to launch into my topic of today in English. So today I want to talk about motivating school improvement from the center, connecting quality assurance with good educational practice. I'm particularly interested in one aspect of this relationship, which is the connection between educators' commitments and motivations on one hand and the mix of incentives, demands, interventions and the like that they are exposed to from the center. The center being the central government, municipalities, foundations, and the like. My focus today, and this is important, is the lower third of the performance spectrum. That is schools that are catering to disadvantaged populations that are ordinarily termed as working class. Those schools differ quite markedly from schools that cater to higher socioeconomic status groups. I am going to approach my topic in two steps. First, I will look at the issue of quality assurance and connecting it to good educational practice through the system level. And then I will move from the system level into the school level. And as I'm doing that, if you will, my methodology changes as well. When I look at the system level, I will look at analysis of large data sets. That is not my specialty. My specialty is the work that I do is I work usually kind of in the case study realm. I use statistics in that. I do design experiments and things like that. So they're a little bit more small scale. So keep in mind, this is my expertise. I'm sure there are people in this room who have different expertise, but mine is in this level. Okay. I think what's important for us is that when we think about this relationship, none of us have the answer. None of us in the room have the answer. We have people who come from economics, from sociology, from management, from the study of instruction. We all contribute something to the picture. The most important thing I thought I could do in my talk today is try to figure out how we might want to frame the conversation to develop a very good solution stream. As we know in problem solving, how we frame the problem is the most important thing. Once we have the frame set, the solutions are generated within the constraints of the frame. So I want today to impress on you, if you will, that an appropriate frame for the problem solving of this particular issue is that we, amongst all the other things that we ordinarily consider, that we first and foremost pay attention, or we often forget that, on the issue of internalization. So if I can do anything today, is if I leave you today with the thought that internalization is really a central concern in the design of all of these various accountability and quality assurance systems, I have accomplished my task. So very briefly, I don't want to spend too much time, but I want to make sure that we have some kind of consensus. This is usually what people generally support. My definition of quality in the instructional core, it is basic skills, and it is also higher order thinking. It includes in all students. It gives competence to everybody who participates in the educational enterprise. As far as the teachers are concerned, they understand the basic drill and practice, classroom management and the like, and the complex development of academic engagement. And what is key, they also are able to identify the needs for self-learning, since so many teachers work fairly autonomously in their classrooms. So there are various mechanisms with which we could guarantee quality in the system that connects schools to the center. There is a local mechanism, a professional mechanism, and an administrative mechanism. And I understand from the conversations I've had here, as everywhere else, most countries have a mix of those kinds of mechanisms, and Chile definitely seems to have a mix of those. So in the local mechanism, really quickly, we have often local elites or parents directly overseeing teachers whose professional status is rather low. Or they make their desires known as consumers. They shop for school and they decide not to go to this school or that school. Now, in the United States, the prevalent mechanism has been this, the local mechanism, but not private education. In the United States, there are only 15% of the students that go to private education. This recently expanded. Traditionally, it was no more than 7%. So overall, the United States is a system that, until very recently, thoroughly believed in its public education system. And it is important to recognize that in the United States, for example, whenever vouchers have been up for election, they usually have to be voted on by people directly in referendums. They have been voted down. And the reason being is that the middle class in the suburbs, in the United States, the working class lives in the large cities, and the middle class lives in the suburbs. The middle class refuses to give up on the established middle class public institution. Okay? So this is important to keep in mind. So the problem, of course, with the local mechanism is that, or the advantage is that there's a direct communication between client needs and service providers, but the disadvantage is if the local elites don't know what is really required societally, then we're in trouble. Okay? The professional mechanisms work differently. Here, we rely on professional institutions, associations, universities, and the like, that inculcate professional norms and of conduct and expectations, skills and expectations. So professional mechanisms are usually more like influence-based. They are network-based. They are soft. They work more through more broad structures, so to speak, and they work in the long term. So that is their disadvantage. That is, soft power mechanisms such as professional mechanisms are unwieldy. You can't just say, okay, I'm going to do this. It usually takes a generation to create a professional mechanism to take hold. Okay? But once it takes hold, it is usually going deep. Problem, of course, is that whatever is consensual within the profession gets tolerated. So if the profession tolerates the neglect of disadvantaged populations, then that is not going to be altered by the profession itself. So we need administrative mechanisms. And those are the usual ones. You are all familiar with them. I don't have to go over them. But it should be noted that it has some great advantages, the mirror image of the professional mechanisms, which is that high-level administrators and politicians, both on the left and on the right, by the way. This is not a left and right issue in the United States. In the United States, definitely, it's not a left and right issue. So it's in the United States, the left and the right are in favor of one system over another. The dividing lines is usually between people that are positioned on top of the system and people that are asked to carry out the decisions that the top is making. So I think this is very important to realize where the conflict lines are in the development of these kinds of systems. So there's forceful action that can happen from the center. But the problem is, of course, that the center can only influence the system with fairly simple levers that have to somehow make it in the complexity of the day-to-day. And as we know from long lines of implementation research, there's often a shallow motivation and a shallow implementation of all those central levers. Okay, so the US, this is the beautiful thing. The US is truly a test case of how an administrative system is working out. In the US, we have a system that has, since it starts from the base of the local system that traditionally had a weak profession, a strong administration at the local level, but fairly weak administration at the central level. It puts on top of this system a very tight incentive, very strongly controlled central incentive system with these kinds of, as you can see here, with these kinds of components: standards, yearly standardized tests, quantitative growth targets, feedback and diagnostics so that the students know, that the schools know where they are in the system, incentives and sanctions that provide pressures and rewards, and finally interventions that channel supports to the most needy local systems. This just simply illustrates what I was pointing out to you before, which is that in the United States, maybe not unlike Chile, the state level is actually very weak in terms of its bureaucratic capacity, in terms of the apparatus that is available to set these kinds of systems in motion. So what you see is that if the incentives don't work, the system won't work. Okay? So the theory of action is that if we create goals and clear messages, transparent quantitative targets and performance information to the schools and to the market, schools will pick up on this and they will try to attain the goals. The large majority of the schools, that's a sufficient enough message. Then there are some schools who won't respond to those goals. That is, goal attainment alone won't do it. For them, we have pressures and sanctions. And so the idea is that if we add pressures and sanctions to the picture, there's yet another group of schools that will respond to that and they will make it. That is, they will get their growth targets accomplished. Then there's going to be a small number of schools that will not respond to either goal attainment or pressure and sanctions. Those need targeted interventions. And with those three steps, the overwhelming majority of the schools will reach their growth targets. And the few that don't reach those goals ought to be either closed down or radically restructured. That's the theory of action. Okay? So if this theory of action actually works, then we would actually have closed the achievement gap after a certain period of time, because this is the the key structure of the system that was passed into law in 2001, the name of the law is No Child Left Behind, is that the growth targets are calculated as the difference between a baseline in 2001 and the closing of the achievement gap in 2014. Now, we know that this particular theory of action did not work. In the United States, we have a low-stakes test, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, that shows us that in 20 years of accountability, 10 years of federal accountability and 10 years of state accountability at the state level, we have, this is the best case scenario, which is NAEP reading and math, oh no, this is only NAEP reading in fourth grade, that is, as 9-year-olds. As you can see, the gains are not trivial, but they're not great. Look at 17-year-old students in high school, and the gains have essentially washed out. If I would show you middle school, you would see that middle school falls right between elementary school and high school. So in math, as you can see, math actually in elementary school worked better, according to the low-stakes test National Assessment of Educational Progress. Again, the changes are not trivial, but they are not great. And you can see, this is, you can see for the 17-year-olds, again, no gain. Well, since the economy picks up on the 17-year-olds and not on the 9-year-olds, we have a problem. We haven't actually gotten much mileage out of the systems. When you look at the black-white achievement gap, which is often a statistic that is used, that also has, in math, has closed a little bit, but overall the achievement gap has not closed in 20 years of high-stakes accountability and the power of incentives. So obviously something is wrong with the system. And the federal government has recognized this and is in the process right now of thoroughly revamping the entire system. And I don't think I'm going to have time to talk about that. But anyway, but look here. We're comparing the state tests, which are high stakes, with the federal monitoring test, which are low stakes. And what you can see is percent proficient is the statistic here, that NAEP, as expressed in percent proficient for math, remained constant for those 2 years, but actually I just picked the 2 years. That analysis applies to the rest of the years as well. But the high stakes test really took off. So what's going on here? This is very, very strange. Obviously, and this is the kind of work that I have been doing, obviously when you put schools under the pressure of accountability, they actually do take heed of it. They actually do listen to the message, and they expend enormous energy of trying to avoid to be sanctioned by the system. What do? They don't do the things that we expect them to do, but they are motivated to do it. So if you look through this, I don't have time to go through all of these aspects, but basically schools orient themselves according to the guidance system of the instructional guidance systems of the accountability system. They try to align their curriculum. They try to narrow the curriculum. They try to make sure that they are meeting the test goals that the state has set for them. So it works in some ways. The system works. But it's not working because it doesn't do the right thing in terms of good educational practice. Now, the one thing that I want to point out to you is the last point, which I think is very, very important, and we need to keep it in mind when we think about system redesign, is when you look in the schools and you break out the teachers that are most motivated by this particular system. Keep in mind that the system holds schools accountable, not individual teachers. It is the most committed teachers that feel most motivated to do something about the low performance. But these are the teachers that are least in need of a motivating incentive, because they do the work anyway. So what they're doing is they're getting into this frenzy, and this frenzy, when the school doesn't succeed in the system, kind kind of tips over into demoralization. And what we have in the schools is a constant brain drain, if you will, of the best teachers that go into environments in which they are not labeled low performing, not labeled failing. And this, of course, is for the lower third performance spectrum a really damning result. So we have to stop that at all cost. And these systems don't do that. Okay? So one thing that I want to point out, and very, very briefly, is what we've created, we have noticed, and this is where the federal government stepped in the redesign of the system, is we've created what is called a race to the bottom. That is, all those systems that addressed quality assurance with low cognitive demand kinds of tests have worked really well. I'm not skipping this. Have worked really well, while the systems that try to move schools with cognitively highly complex tests have failed. I have the comparison of Maryland versus Texas here. You see the Texas system has that trajectory still going up, whereas the Maryland system scrapped its assessment, its highly complex assessment, because it was felt that the system didn't have the capacity to excel in the system. The teachers didn't have the capacity to excel in this particular system. Okay? So we have states that are highly demanding in their cognitive assessments and states that are of low demand. And you can see Texas being a state with very low demand tests, only 6% of the schools being identified as failing, whereas California, with a very high demand definition of proficient, has 20% of the schools low performing or in need of improvement in 2003. Now look at the thing for California in 2008 or 2009. 48% of the schools and 61% of the local authorities are identified as failing, as in need of improvement. Obviously, the total dysfunctionality of the system, and that's why it's being scrapped right now. So what we have seen is a system in which the demands are high in the state of California. The demands are high. The capacities in the low SES schools are low. The internal valuation of the system is of questionable nature. That is, there's large skepticism within the schools. And pressure doesn't work in this kind of environment. So the failing schools go up. Here is the kind of learning culture that is created. I have a meta-synthesis of various studies on instruction. And you can see that overall, in most instances where schools' instructional changes have been studied, we see contraction, a fractured, fragmented curriculum, and a very teacher-centered way of teaching. This is not something, this is a learning culture that we simply do not want to incentivize. Okay? I would say that the main points that we're dealing with in designing these kinds of systems is that there is the simplicity of indicators and the quality of diagnostics leaves something to be desired. We have schools that are identified as failing, that are actually not failing when you go into them and you study them in detail in terms of their instructional quality or in terms of their culture. They're actually ready to take off, but the system declares them as failures. We have the problem of non-standard student populations. If you don't put a target, a quantitative target on the performance of, say, special education populations or limited English speaker populations, if you don't put a target on them, they will be neglected by the schools. But if you put a target on them, they will not succeed in the system unless you create targets that differ depending on the population. That is ideologically impossible in a system that wants to equalize achievement. Okay? Now, I will only, of the various hypotheses that we could discuss about this particular system, I only want to pick up on one, the willingness hypothesis, which says that it is the willingness of the teaching profession that is responsible for the achievement gap. We now know that that hypothesis is simply not true. because teachers did exactly what was expected of them, and the achievement gap did not close. So we have to look for other solutions. Okay? I believe that the challenge is how to integrate the central levers into the valued purposes of educators. And the second thing is how to make central indicators radiate out into the complexity of educators' tasks. Okay? I don't have time, I realize, to actually discuss why the bridging from a central indicator to the life of schools is so incredibly hard, particularly in the lower socioeconomic spectrum. But suffice it to say is that the teacher is placed by society in a very difficult situation. The teacher needs to bridge what society expects students to learn and what youth culture is all about, which is not necessarily congruent, and increasingly less so in our societies, as in modern society, kids become more autonomous, become more enraptured in their own youth culture and the like. So the job is really difficult, and teachers have usually been given autonomy by society to find ways to bridge. Okay? Now, we have to ask ourselves, what kind of motivational model is really appropriate for this kind of situation? When you read the literature on incentives in education, usually expectancy models and goal attainment models, that is, we are incentivizing teachers with rewards and we are incentivizing teachers with clear goals is what is highlighted. But I believe that actually that is not a motivational model that will actually capture what we're dealing with. I think that self-determination theory and self-concept theory are actually good candidates to understand this as well. In self-determination theory, the issue of internalization is problematized. That is, if you have a regulation that stays external, it has limited motivational power as far as the complex work of teachers is concerned. What you are actually trying to aim at is integrated. What's the difference between external or interjected and integrated is that when a teacher feels that there's integration, he or she feels that the levers, the central levers, have become part of them. It doesn't mean that they love them. They're not intrinsically motivated. They're not, it's that they feel that they have value in guiding them. And we need to find ways to connect these levers to the internal valued purposes of the schools. Okay. I like the term integrity for this. When a school has integrity, according to a study that I have conducted, of which I want to speak very, very briefly, when a school has integrity, it has found a way of crafting coherence among the various demands that it is subjected to, be it central demands, demands by the community and the like, which are not usually working themselves out in a coherent kind of way. It requires an active forging of coherence. Okay? This is what other people, of course, have studied as well. In addition to that, the moral core of the organization has to revolve around this kind of coherence. So the concept of integrity, I think, is very powerful in that it tries to bring together the technical and the moral side of teacher motivation. So I did a study of a number of schools in the state of California, middle schools with a demographic of 80% low SES Hispanic populations in the Los Angeles area. And it took us 1 year to find the 5 highest performing middle schools in the state and the 5 lowest performing middle schools in the state for this particular demographic. Of course, it took us the longest to find the 5 lowest performing schools. They didn't want to participate in the study, of course. Anyway, so what you're seeing here is what I was trying to figure out is, okay, what happens in those schools in which this kind of integrity is happening? And what you can see, I don't have time to go into this, is in the pluses and the minuses indicate standard deviations and the like, means and standard deviations. What you can see is that in this integrity pattern, you actually have with it, and I'm not making a causal argument here, with integrity, you have all the good qualities that we want in a school that is ready to take off. That is, they have open communication, they learn, They raise expectations, they pull together, they feel a strong sense of shared responsibility. So we really have a desirable culture in these kinds of schools that I found hinges upon creating this kind of integrity. What you can also see is that the usual defensiveness that low SES schools have towards the center, because they do feel misunderstood by the center in the hard work that they themselves feel they need to do, you see that schools that create integrity actually are not as defensive. They find that the accountability system is actually meaningful, valid, and fair, compared, relatively speaking, to the other ones, okay? Very, very briefly, and then I will finish. So how did this integrity come about? Well, I looked at, this is just an illustration, okay? I looked at a number of schools, and we have 2 schools with high integrity and 2 schools with low integrity. The 2 schools with high integrity, built integrity is usually the leadership that does it, built integrity in a different kind of way. One school actually fuses the levers of the accountability system, the tests, the information, the diagnostic, with a broader sense of good professional practice. There's a fusion. The other one did something very different. It said, we cannot look at the accountability system in order to be good. We have to give accountability system second place in the hierarchy of our normative order, and we have to highlight what we think is best, and we will pursue that, and accountability will take care of itself. Now, we also have low integrity schools in which, in one school, very, very kind of progressive pedagogy, in which the profession is seen as in opposition to the system. In this school, which actually had a very, very high instructional quality when we visited classrooms, the accountability system was destructive. That is, it upset the school, it fragmented the school, so it was truly counterproductive for this kind of school. And then we have a school that is in which, this is probably the most prevalent pattern in schools across the United States, in which the faculty is in opposition to the leadership and the accountability system comes in as an authoritative system, and teachers largely comply. And compliance stands for minimal effort. Teachers, as we know, or schools in this kind of system can actually make it in the system, although the number of failing schools speaks otherwise, because what is needed in the race to the bottom is a learning culture of drill and practice for which most teachers have enough energy and for which compliance is sufficient. Okay? So I will have to finish here. I can't actually come to the synthesis, but I would hope that, you know, what are the lessons from all of this, which will hopefully come up in the Q&A afterwards. Okay? So thank you very much.